The glass of the penthouse windows rattled against the storm, but the real tempest was suffocating the room. Imani's knuckles turned white around the edges of the medical tray. She wasn't trapped in some dark basement. Her prison was made of floor-to-ceiling glass and crushing social isolation. She was entirely cut off from the world, reduced to a ghost tending to a monster. She set the medication down, the sharp clink of glass cutting through the heavy silence. She turned on her heel, desperate to retreat to the safety of her lonely quarters, to finally escape him for the night. But a sudden, desperate grip locked around her arm. The IV line snapped taut. Woo-Jin, the ruthless head of the Seoul underworld, a man who commanded armies and destroyed lives with a whisper, was sitting beside his hospital bed, his chest heaving. The cold, calculating kingpin was gone. "Don't leave me tonight." Woo-Jin's voice broke, completely stripped of its venom as he looked up at her, utterly defeated. "Please." If you're ready to see how this dangerous and emotional romance unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. The skyline of the city bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, fractured shadows across the imported marble. Up here, in the stratosphere of the elite, the air always felt impossibly thin. For Imani, it was entirely suffocating. She moved silently through the sprawling, hyper-modern living space, her uniform immaculate, her expression completely unreadable. She wasn't confined to some dark, hidden cellar. Her prison was made of bulletproof glass and endless, echoing luxury. She was a ghost by design, navigating the cold corridors of a man who owned half the city's underworld. She wiped a microscopic speck of dust from a polished obsidian table, her movements precise and mechanical. Every action was strictly calculated to avoid drawing attention. In the empire of Woo-Jin, being noticed was the most dangerous thing a person could be. She had seen the way his lieutenants looked at him when they visited the penthouse, with a mixture of absolute reverence and stark, visceral terror. Imani wanted no part of his world, his violent wars, or his power. She just wanted the generous paycheck that deposited into her secure account at the end of every month. It was her ticket out, her slow, meticulous crawl toward a life where she could finally breathe. The penthouse was an impenetrable fortress, yet it felt profoundly empty. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant, muffled hum of traffic hundreds of feet below. It was a gilded cage that deeply isolated her from the outside world. There were no casual conversations, no friendly exchanges with the rotating security detail. Everyone was too terrified to step out of line. There was only the rigorous work, the crushing isolation, and the looming, oppressive presence of the man who ruled it all. Whenever Woo-Jin was home, the very atmosphere in the penthouse would physically shift, the air growing thick and highly charged. Imani would keep her eyes fixed firmly on the floor, erasing herself completely as his sharp, commanding footsteps echoed past her. She never looked directly at his face, never lingered in his periphery for a second longer than her duties required. She was a master of surviving by disappearing. But as she stood before the towering windows, watching the first heavy drops of an approaching storm begin to streak across the glass, a sudden, chilling thought crept into her mind. You can only remain invisible for so long before someone standing in the dark finally looks your way. The storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke, hammering aggressively against the reinforced glass. Imani was in the kitchen, finishing her final rounds, when the private elevator chimed, a sharp, alarming sound that never occurred past midnight. The heavy steel doors slid open, and the suffocating silence of the penthouse was instantly shattered by the chaotic thud of heavy boots and harsh, urgent whispers. Two towering bodyguards practically dragged a figure through the grand foyer, leaving a thick, dark trail of blood across the pristine white marble. It was Woo-Jin. The untouchable kingpin of the Seoul underworld was entirely unrecognizable. His crisp, tailored suit was soaked in crimson, his sharp features pale and contorted in silent agony. The men didn't take him to a hospital. In his world, a hospital was just an open invitation for an assassin to finish the job. They hauled him toward the master suite, the sharp, metallic tang of copper instantly filling the sterile air of the penthouse. Imani froze, her every instinct screaming at her to retreat, to disappear into her quarters and lock the door. Survival meant staying blind to the syndicate's violence. But as one of the guards frantically tore through the trauma supplies stashed in the panic room, a trembling hand dropped a suture kit. They were soldiers, not surgeons, and the frantic energy in the room was rapidly turning into panic. Woo-Jin's eyes, usually cold and imperious, were hazy as they fluttered open. Through the chaos, his unfocused gaze drifted and locked onto her from across the hall. There was no command in them, only the raw, desperate edge of a man rapidly bleeding out on his own floor. "You," the lead guard barked, his voice cracking with adrenaline as he pointed a bloody finger at Imani. "Get in here, now." Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every rule she made to protect herself demanded she walk away, but the sheer gravity of the moment anchored her in place. She stepped out of the shadows, carefully maneuvering to avoid the pooling blood on the marble. "Hold this," the guard ordered, shoving a pressurized bandage into her trembling hands. As she pressed down on Woo-Jin's shoulder, her skin brushed against his. He was burning up, a stark contrast to the cold, untouchable aura he had always projected. He hissed through clenched teeth, his head thrashing against the pillows as the guards began to work on the deepest wounds. Imani swallowed hard, forcing her panicked breaths to steady. She wasn't just a ghost in the background anymore. As the thunder rattled the high-rise, she looked down at the blood permanently staining her immaculate uniform and realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that she had just been dragged into the very center of his dangerous world. The master suite had been violently transformed from a sanctuary of high-end luxury into a sterile, makeshift trauma ward. The heavy scent of sharp antiseptic now masked the faint, familiar notes of Woo-Jin's expensive cologne. The rhythmic, agonizingly slow beep of a heart monitor was the only sound that pierced the suffocating quiet of the room. Woo-Jin was confined to the center of the massive bed, pale and stripped of his tailored armor. An intricate web of transparent IV lines tethered him to a steel pole, feeding fluids and painkillers directly into his veins. Imani stood beside the bed, her movements sharp and meticulously controlled. She was no longer just dusting obsidian tables, she was swacking out saline bags and measuring liquid dosages with cold, mechanical precision. The syndicate's underground doctor had stabilized him and vanished into the night, leaving behind a strict schedule of medications and a stark warning about the high risk of infection. With his trusted guards heavily patrolling the perimeter of the building, the deeply intimate task of keeping the boss alive had fallen entirely to the ghost in the maid's uniform. She reached across him to adjust the flow rate of the drip, keeping her eyes firmly locked on the small, rolling dial of the IV tube. She could feel the intense heat radiating from his skin. Worse, she could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of his gaze. Woo-Jin was awake. He hadn't spoken a single word since the chaotic night he was dragged in, but his dark, piercing eyes followed her every move. Stripped of his lieutenants and his weapons, his relentless observation was the only control he had left. To Imani, it felt like being hunted by a wounded predator from behind the glass of a cage. "You're shaking." His voice suddenly rasped, rough as sandpaper, instantly shattering the long silence. Imani's breath hitched, but she forced her hands to remain perfectly steady as she secured the plastic line. She deliberately ignored the comment, refusing to look down at his face. Engaging him in any personal capacity was crossing a dangerous boundary she could not afford to breach. She smoothed out the pristine white sheets near his waist, her expression a perfectly constructed mask of professional detachment. "The doctor will return at midnight to check your vitals," she stated evenly, her voice completely devoid of any tremor, entirely dismissing his observation. She picked up her empty silver tray and turned of her heel to retreat, desperate to put the heavy oak door between them. But as she walked away, the silent, heavy intensity of his stare burned into her back, a quiet promise that the invisible walls she had built to protect herself were already beginning to fracture. The penthouse had always been a fortress, but as the days bled into one another, it began to feel more like a besieged bunker. Whispers seeped through the heavy oak doors of the master suite like a slow-acting poison. Word of Woo-Jin's vulnerability had inevitably leaked into the city's concrete veins. In the sprawling living room beyond his medical sanctuary, the air grew thick with the suppressed, nervous energy of ambitious men. His top lieutenants gathered under the guise of paying their respects, but the low, urgent murmurs that drifted down the hall spoke of shifting loyalties and quiet calculations. They were circling like vultures, waiting for the king to finally stop breathing. Woo-Jin lay entirely motionless among the stark white sheets, his sharp instincts undulled by the heavy painkillers coursing through his IV line. He could hear the barely concealed eagerness in his underboss's voice whenever a guard reported a slight dip in his vitals to the men outside. Every shadow that stretched across his doorway seemed to hold a dagger. In his world of cutthroat syndicates and violent power grabs, blood meant nothing, and loyalty only lasted as long as a man's physical strength. Trust was a liability he had shed decades ago, but lying broken and defenseless, the absence of it was suddenly deafening. Amidst the creeping paranoia, the only constant was the quiet, rhythmic tread of the woman in the maid's uniform. Imani moved through the tense, volatile atmosphere of the penthouse, completely untouched by the politics outside his door. Her profound social isolation, a defensive wall she had so carefully cultivated to keep the violent world at bay, now stood in stark contrast to the deceptive posturing of his men. She entered his room holding a fresh tray of sterile bandages, her face a masterclass in strict professional indifference. She didn't let her eyes linger on his hidden safes. She didn't ask probing, opportunistic questions about his recovery timeline. She simply checked his monitors, adjusted the steady drip of his intravenous fluids, and replaced his dressings with clinical, unhurried precision. For the first time, Woo-Jin truly studied her, not as a fixture of his luxurious surroundings, but as a striking anomaly. She was entirely cut off from his dark ecosystem, beautifully indifferent to the empire currently fracturing just on the other side of her silver tray. As she leaned over to inspect the healing sutures across his chest, her cool, steady fingers, completely devoid of the nervous hesitation or hidden agendas of his soldiers, a stark realization washed over the ruthless boss. In a towering skyscraper packed with his most elite, heavily armed guards, this fiercely detached, invisible woman was the only person in the entire building who wasn't silently praying for his death. The midnight hours in the penthouse were usually the quietest, but tonight the silence felt brittle, stretched impossibly thin over an underlying tension. Imani sat perfectly still in the dimly lit corner of the master suite, the faint blue glow of the medical monitors casting long shadows across the walls. She was tucked away in her own quiet isolation, deliberately ignoring the sheer scale of the power and violence that slumbered just a few feet away. But the steady, reassuring rhythm of the heart monitor suddenly hitched, accelerating into a rapid, erratic tempo. Imani rose from her chair, her professional instincts overriding her deep desire to remain invisible. She approached the bed, her footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. Woo-Jin was no longer lying perfectly still in his cold, calculated repose. The heavy, stifling heat of a sudden fever radiated from his skin, turning his pale complexion a flushed, unhealthy gray. He thrashed weakly against the stark white sheets, a sheen of sweat covering his forehead, as a violent nightmare dragged the ruthless kingpin back into whatever dark memory was currently haunting him. A low, tortured sound escaped his lips, a fractured, breathless syllable that sounded nothing like the terrifying boss who commanded the city. It was the raw, desperate sound of a man completely stripped of his armor, drowning in the dark corners of his own mind. He shifted violently, and the IV line pulled dangerously taut against his forearm. Imani reached out with clinical urgency, intending only to stabilize his arm and prevent the needle from tearing his vein. But as her fingers brushed his burning skin, Woo-Jin's hand suddenly jerked upward. His large, calloused fingers blindly clamped around hers with a desperate, crushing grip. Imani froze, her breath catching sharply in her throat. Every defense mechanism she had painstakingly built screamed at her to pull away, to firmly re-establish the insurmountable boundary between them. She was just the mate, he was the monster. Letting him anchor himself to her was a terrifying crossing of lines. She gave a slight, instinctive tug to free her hand, but his grip tightened. A low, pleading breath left his chest as his fevered mind sought the only solid thing in his night terror. For a long, agonizing moment, Imani stood paralyzed by the bed. The impenetrable ice that she kept wrapped tightly around her own life warred with the undeniable, broken humanity of the man holding on to her. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid tension in her shoulders dropped. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a slow, shaking breath and gently curled her fingers around his rough hand. It was a fleeting, terrifying moment of pure vulnerability, a single, fatal crack in the ice that neither of them would ever be able to repair. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, banishing the shadows of the night before, but it did nothing to melt the icy panic gripping Imani's chest. The memory of the previous midnight, the desperate heat of Woo-Jin's hand clinging to hers in the dark, played on a relentless, terrifying loop in her mind. By allowing that fleeting moment of profound vulnerability, she had crossed an invisible, highly dangerous line. She had let the monster become a man, and in his violent world, humanity was a fatal liability. When she entered the master suite to deliver his morning medication, she was completely transformed. The subtle, quiet softening that had begun to creep into her demeanor over the past few days was violently eradicated, replaced by a facade of absolute, impenetrable frost. She didn't look at his face. She didn't speak. Her movements, usually graceful and carefully calculated, were now sharp, rigid, and strictly mechanical. She was a phantom in a uniform, physically present but emotionally entirely out of reach. Woo-Jin noticed the shift the second she crossed the threshold. His fever had broken, leaving his mind sharp and his predatory instincts fully alert once again. His dark eyes tracked her every movement, searching for the quiet, steady woman who had anchored him through his night terrors. Instead, he found only a pristine, empty shell. The warmth of her touch had completely vanished, leaving behind a chilling void that unsettled him far more than the physical pain radiating from his healing wounds. He opened his mouth to speak, to bridge the sudden, jarring chasm between them, but the sharp clatter of a glass vial against her silver tray instantly silenced him. Imani set the dosage down with aggressive finality. The sheer intensity of his gaze was suffocating her, making the vast, luxurious space feel like a rapidly shrinking cage. She could feel the delicate threads of her carefully constructed isolation snapping under the heavy weight of his unspoken questions. She couldn't do this. She couldn't let herself be pulled into the gravitational orbit of a man who dealt in death, loyalty, and absolute possession. As she stepped back from the bed, putting as much physical distance between them as the walls allowed, a cold, unshakable resolve settled over her. The generous paycheck no longer mattered. The flawless security of the high-rise was completely irrelevant. Staying here meant risking the one thing she had fought so fiercely to protect, herself. She kept her eyes firmly locked on the heavy oak door as she retreated, mentally drafting the quiet, untraceable exit she would make the moment her final shift ended. She had survived this long by knowing exactly when to disappear, and she had needed to vanish more than she did right now. The sky above the city finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour that perfectly mirrored the chaotic, suffocating energy trapped inside the penthouse. Heavy sheets of rain violently battered the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rhythmic, deafening drumming drowning out the low hum of the traffic hundreds of feet below. Inside, the air was impossibly thick, charged with an unspoken, dangerous electricity that made every breath Imani took feel forced and shallow. She stood alone in the immaculate kitchen, the harsh flashes of lightning illuminating her tense, drawn features in brief, stark bursts of white light. With meticulous, unhurried precision, she arranged the final dosage of painkillers and sterile bandages onto her silver medical tray. Her hands, usually so flawless in their execution, betrayed a slight involuntary tremor. This was it, the final tray, the very last time she would ever step foot in his room. Her small, unassuming duffel bag was already packed and hidden out of sight near the service elevator. The exact moment his vitals were checked and his bandages were secured, she was going to vanish into the raging storm, leaving the perilous, violent orbit of the syndicate kingpin forever. She picked up the tray, the quiet clink of the glass vial echoing sharply against the tense silence of the hallway. When she pushed open the heavy oak door to the master suite, the oppressive weight of the room instantly hit her, freezing her momentarily in the doorway. Woo-Jin was awake. He was sitting up slightly against the stark white pillows, the dark, shifting shadows of the storm playing across his sharp, unreadable face. The medical monitors beside him beeped a steady, relentless rhythm, but his piercing eyes were fixed entirely on her the exact second she crossed the threshold. There was a dangerous, heavy finality hanging in the space between them. He could feel it. The cold, impenetrable walls she had violently resurrected that morning were now absolute, and the distance she was deliberately placing between them was deafening. Imani approached the bed in total silence, avoiding his intense gaze with practiced, mechanical precision. She set the silver tray down on the bedside table, the storm raging violently against the glass just a few feet away, blurring the vibrant city lights into chaotic streaks of neon. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to hurry, to dispense the medication and flee before the invisible tether snapping between them could drag her under. She reached for the small glass vial, her movements stiff and robotic, desperate to complete this one final task and escape the suffocating, heavy intensity of a man who was quietly realizing he was about to lose the only genuine anchor he had left in his fractured world. The thunder cracked like a gunshot, rattling the glass as Imani set the small amber bottle onto the silver tray. She didn't pour the water, she didn't wait to check his monitors. Every second she remained in the suffocating gravity of the master suite felt like a fatal misstep. Her duties were officially over, her duffel bag was already hidden downstairs, and the absolute safety of her quiet, isolated room, and eventually her complete disappearance was only a few steps away. She turned on her heel, her eyes fixed rigidly on the heavy oak door, determined not to look back. She had made it exactly 2 steps when the sharp, frantic squeak of the mattress springs shattered the room's heavy silence. Imani gasped as a large, calloused hand clamped firmly around her bare forearm. She spun around, her heart violently slamming against her ribs. Woo-Jin was no longer confined beneath the sterile white sheets. Completely ignoring the severe trauma to his chest and the strict, life-saving orders of his underground doctor, the ruthless syndicate boss had forced himself up. He sat on the very edge of the bed, planting himself directly in her path, bridging the physical distance she had tried so desperately to maintain. The sudden, reckless movement pulled his IV line dangerously taut, the plastic tubing straining against his bruised skin, but he didn't even flinch. His dark, piercing eyes locked onto hers, and the breath entirely left her lungs. The terrifying, untouchable kingpin she had spent weeks avoiding was completely gone. His sharp features were stripped of their cold authority, leaving behind an expression of raw, agonizing desperation. His grip on her arm wasn't the forceful command of a man used to taking whatever he wanted. It was the heavy, trembling hold of a man who was terrified of drowning in his own darkness. The rain lashed violently against the window, framing the impossible scene. He was bleeding for a vast criminal empire, surrounded by ambitious men who wanted him dead. Yet the only thing he was fighting for at this exact moment was the fiercely independent woman desperately trying to walk away from him. "Don't leave me tonight," Woo-Jin whispered, his rough voice cracking under the weight of a vulnerability he had not shown another living soul in decades. He looked up at her, entirely surrendering his pride, his power, and his impenetrable walls. "Please." The single fractured word hung in the charged air, echoing louder than the storm outside. The ruthless Korean mafia boss wasn't issuing a command, he was begging. Imani stared down at the devastatingly broken man clutching her arm, the heavy silver tray forgotten behind them. The impenetrable ice she had painstakingly cultivated to survive was beginning to violently shatter, leaving her standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into a dangerous, undeniable new reality where walking out that door was suddenly the hardest thing she could ever do. The silence in the room stretched until it felt as fragile as glass, drowned out only by the relentless pounding of the storm against the high-rise windows. Imani stared down at the hand gripping her arm. Woo-Jin's knuckles were white, his skin burning with the fading remnants of a fever, but his hold was incredibly gentle, a stark, disarming contrast to the violent world he commanded. He wasn't forcing her to stay, he was giving her the choice. For the first time since she had stepped into his opulent, suffocating world, the insurmountable power dynamic between them completely fractured. He was no longer the untouchable kingpin of the Seoul underworld, and she was no longer the invisible ghost fading into the background of his penthouse. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, stripped of his lieutenants, his weapons, and his impenetrable armor, the most dangerous man in the city had placed his emotional survival entirely in her hands. Imani's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The small duffel bag hidden downstairs, her meticulously planned escape, the absolute safety of her isolation, it all suddenly felt hollow compared to the raw, agonizing desperation in his dark eyes. If she walked out that heavy oak door now, she would preserve her quiet, uncomplicated life, but she would completely destroy the broken man anchoring himself to her. She looked away from his piercing gaze, her eyes drifting to the silver tray resting on the bedside table, then back to the taut IV line, pulling dangerously against her bruised skin. A shaky, uneven breath escaped her lips. The impenetrable walls she had spent years building to protect herself finally crumbled, collapsing under the terrifying, undeniable weight of a connection she could no longer outrun. Slowly, deliberately, Imani turned her body fully toward him. She didn't pull her arm away. Instead, she reached out with her free hand, her trembling fingers gently brushing over his calloused knuckles before carefully loosening his desperate grip. Woo-Jin's breath hitched, a fleeting flash of pure devastation crossing his sharp features as he thought she was rejecting his plea. But Imani didn't step back. She stepped closer. She guided his hand back to his side, easing the dangerous tension on the plastic IV tubing. And then she did the one thing she had sworn never to do. She sat down on the very edge of the mattress, right beside him, in the dark. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rain, yet it echoed with absolute, world-shifting finality.
Woo-Jin let out a low, ragged exhale, his eyes slipping shut as he leaned his heavy forehead against her shoulder, completely surrendering to her presence. The king had bowed, the ghost had finally been seen, and in the quiet sanctuary of the storm, they both silently accepted the terrifying, irreversible reality that their lives would never be the same.
And just like that, the rules of the game have entirely changed. The most ruthless man in the soul underworld surrendered his pride, his power, and his guarded heart, all for the fiercely independent woman who made the terrifying choice to stay in the storm. The ghost is finally visible, and the king is irrevocably tied to her. But in a city built on violence, cutthroat ambition, and shifting loyalties, what happens when the rest of the syndicate discovers his ultimate weakness? Will Imani's choice be their salvation, or the very thing that destroys them both? If this intense, slow-burn emotional roller coaster kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the explosive next chapter of their story. And before you go, I want to know who is riding out this storm with us. Drop a comment below and let me know exactly what city or country you're watching from today. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe in the dark.